ワールドデコーダー始まります。今日のテーマは Netflix とワーナーブラザーズ世紀の巨額買収の行方です。12月5日、動画配信大手の Netflix が映画スタジオやテレビ局を擁するワーナーブラザーズディスカバリーを約11兆円で買収すると発表しました。すでにビッグテックはハリウッドを飲み込みつつあり、そんな衝撃が業界に今広がっています。ネットフリックスはここ日本でも今や1000万人の登録者を抱えているんですね。これだけのその映画と動画配信の大再編なんですが、日本のエンタメファンも人事ではないと思います。そして実はこの買収まだ決着がついていないんです。同じく映画大手のパラマウントからネットフリックスに対抗する買収提案が出てきています。そこにはトランプ大統領の影もちらついています。今、映画の都ハリウッドで何が起きているのか、今日はブルームバーグでメディアエンターテインメント業界を担当するルーカス・ショー記者に3つのテーマで話を聞きたいと思います。1つ目は、ネットフリックスは巨額買収で何をするのか、この買収の詳細について詳しく聞いていきます。そして2つ目が、アメリカのメディア戦争とトランプの影。先ほど私がトランプ大統領の影もちらついているという話をしたんですが、かなりですね、そのメディアと政治の複雑な関係が現れてきています。このあたり、現地で見ているルーカス記者のならではの視点を伺います。そして最後がメディアの未来、Netflix vs YouTube です。いろんなその映画スタジオ同士の戦い、あるいは映画スタジオとストリーミング、その動画配信大手の戦いみたいなことが注目されるんですが、実は最大の競合は YouTube。そんなことが業界でも言われています。この戦いの行方を最後、ルーカスさんに伺います。Okay, we're joined by Lucas Shaw, Bloomberg's entertainment and media reporter. Thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about Netflix and Warner Brothers Discovery mega deal today. And I guess this kept you busy. And do you think you get to enjoy your holiday in this tumultuous time?
I hope so, but I'm not confident. This deal will not be resolved this year unless something unexpected happens. Both Paramount and Netflix have made clear that they're very committed and invested in trying to get the deal done. Netflix, has the edge at the moment, but that could change if Paramount comes back and offers even more money. So most of the folks that I've spoken with expect that this process will last months.
So you're host of Bloomberg's media and entertainment conference called Screen Time, and I guess you talked to a bunch of media executives or streaming giants executives, which includes the Greg Peters, co-CEO of Netflix, or the leaders of Warner Brothers film division, I guess. So I want to ask you quickly, did you see the Netflix Warner deals come in, or did the news take you by surprise?
When I interviewed Greg Peters in October, I would not have predicted that Netflix was going to close a deal to buy Warner Brothers Discovery in 6-7 weeks from then. Netflix is a company that has always been averse to doing major transactions. They've preferred to build stuff and go gradually and internally rather than bring in outside help. My reporting over the years had indicated that Netflix had at least kicked the tires and explored other deals, but never where they were in a position as one of the final bidders or anything like that. Now, that being said, when Greg told me on stage at Screen Time, the conference that you mentioned, that these types of deals have a very bad track record, he really was skeptical of these types of deals. It was a week later, maybe less than that I was speaking with someone else pretty high up at Netflix who suggested that the company was actually pretty interested, right? That they said they weren't sure why Greg had been so negative at the event. Now, again, at that time, most people saw Paramount as the favorite. But over the course of the next few weeks, it became more and more apparent that Netflix was very interested, that they were going to go for it. And usually if Netflix goes for something, they get what they want.
And before we get into the details, for our audience to give them some context about the deal and the industry as a whole, from your perspective, what is happening in Hollywood right now?
Well, over the last decade, we've seen the streaming revolution in Hollywood, right? So Netflix introduced its streaming service in 2007. It separated its streaming service from the DVD by mail service in the US in 2011. And it released its first really famous original program, House of Cards, in 2013. And since then, the number of people who watch film and television online has exploded. The number of people who pay for a traditional TV service, cable or satellite, has gone way down. The movie business has shrunk from its peak. And so that has upended a lot of the biggest players, because most of the big entertainment companies in Hollywood were built on cable networks and studios. And those cable networks in particular were very, very profitable. And so their decline has caused these companies a lot of stress and has made them try to figure out what to do. They all invested heavily in new streaming services to compete with Netflix, but they were late, and their streaming services have been, only kind of successful. Netflix is still way ahead of everyone. And so we've started to see a lot of consolidation as those traditional players try to find ways to compete. So you saw what used to be Time Warner sold to the phone company AT&T, and then merged with Discovery, which was also owned a bunch of other cable networks. You saw Fox, the media empire owned by the Murdoch family, sell a lot of its entertainment assets to Disney, which was trying to get bigger and stronger as it prepared to introduce its streaming services. And you saw CBS and Viacom, two different media companies, recombine and become Paramount. That then got bought by David Ellison. And now you have Warner Brothers once again in play, and you have David Ellison, which is sort of the running Paramount, the much smaller company trying to get the scale that it thinks it needs to compete in streaming. And then you have Netflix, which is sort of the established power, now looking to gobble up one of these studios that it used to be trying to, that it used to be trying to become, right? There's a certain irony in that HBO was in many ways a model for Netflix, and now Netflix is so much bigger than HBO and might just swallow it and kind of offer it as a nice little add-on to a streaming service.
Great, thank you. And first, what this mega deal means to Netflix. Netflix has over 300 million subscribers worldwide. They have huge customer bases, not only in the US, but also in Japan. And the number hit the 10 million last year. People are keeping their eye on its moves. So could you tell us why Netflix needs to acquire Warner Brothers Discovery in the first place?
Well, there's the positive way of looking at it and the negative. The positive would be that this is just an unusual and special asset, right? Warner Brothers is one of the most valuable, storied and productive film and television studios in the world. It's home to DC and Harry Potter, among many other Friends, Big Bang Theory, many, many things, as well as HBO, which has one of the best catalogs of television in the world. And Netflix wants to buy it to strengthen its streaming service, and buy something that's never really had before, right? Netflix has spent its entire kind of time as a company licensing from others, but this would bring one of the great studios in-house. So not only would it be able to offer those shows and movies on its streaming service, but it could then, remake them or make sequels. The more negative version of this would be that Netflix has really struggled to create its own franchises, that it has produced a lot of hits, but not things that kind of really endure in culture and spin off sequels and the types of properties that have been the basis of a company like Disney. And, another negative, I guess, would be that the engagement with Netflix, the amount of time that people are spending on it, hasn't really been growing. And so Netflix is trying to buy growth, which is what you do when you get to a certain scale.
When you talked to Greg Peters on stage, he said that they have not been buyers, they have been builders. So I think M&A is a rare case for Netflix. Did the Warner Brothers Discovery deal mean that much to Netflix?
Oh, it would be huge for them. I mean, it'd be the biggest deal. They've never spent $1 billion buying anything. This would be tens of billions of dollars. It would bring thousands of new employees into the company. It would basically double the size of the company overnight. Warner Brothers does a lot of business practices that Netflix doesn't. It puts movies in theaters for long stretches of time. It has a large video game studio. It produces and sells television shows to other companies. These are all things that Netflix doesn't do, and Netflix says it would change and start to do them if it bought Warner Brothers. So yeah, I think if Netflix bought Warner Brothers, it would be one of the biggest moments in the history of the company.
On the other hand, from the perspective of Warner Brothers, why did they have to go for sale?
Well, they've had a really hard time of it. We talked earlier about this is a company that used to be called Time Warner, and it got sold to AT&T, and then it got merged with Discovery. And HBO is this jewel of an asset, but it has never quite figured out how to compete in streaming. There was a long time where people tried to make it a direct competitor to Netflix, which meant, HBO often specialized in really high-end scripted dramas and comedies, maybe a little stand-up, some documentaries, but it produced a limited number of programs. And in order to compete with Netflix, you had to produce more, and you had to expand what was in there. So suddenly, you added these kind of lowbrow reality TV shows from Discovery, and you had sitcoms and all this other stuff. And it just never quite got there, and it never got the scale in streaming that made it a viable competitor. And so the company that owns it, the Warner Brothers Discovery, that owns HBO, that owns Warner Brothers, that merger of Warner Brothers and Discovery has resulted in largely a falling share price, right? The company is worth less than it was when it started. It's rebounded a little bit, but the share price is down. The total revenue for the company is shrinking because, again, it makes most of its money from the cable networks that we talked about that are going down. And so they feel like the best way to get value for shareholders is to sell it to someone else. Now, we've seen this play out a couple of times, and new owners have not figured it out. But this one feels a little bit different, maybe because if it went to Netflix, that would really be the end of an era for the company. And if it went to Paramount, you'd see two companies that own cable networks, own studios, own streaming services, likely merging them. And so this Time Warner company would probably cease to exist as it does today.
You just compared Netflix to Disney earlier, like Netflix wanted to make more series or spin-off and other franchises like Disney, as you said. So is Netflix coming for Disney?
Well, it's been coming for Disney for years, right? If you look at Netflix historically, when it started to make original programming, its model was HBO, but then it broadened and it started to try to replicate kind of anything you could watch on television, really all of television. And it's tried to copy Disney in some ways, right? There was a point in time at which they were making a huge investment in animated movies. They wanted to make even more movies than Disney. That didn't really work. They bought a small comic book company or kind of producer of comic books type shows. They would love to have those franchises that Disney does. It's the one thing that they've never quite figured out.
And how is Hollywood reacting to this deal so far?
Very negatively. The major trade unions have opposed it. A lot of filmmakers have come out against it. I think there is going to be resistance to Warner Brothers being sold no matter what, because it would mean potentially the elimination of a studio. Consolidation has led to a lot of job losses already, and this would produce even more of that. And then I think there's concern about Netflix in particular, because it's a company that has caused so much change in the business over the last 10 years. The idea of this company that was kind of an outsider swallowing one of the great studios scares a lot of people, especially because they don't know if that means Warner Brothers will keep releasing movies in theaters or not. And the theatrical business has been quite weak.
So if you think from consumers' standpoint, how do you think Netflix is going to change with this deal?
It's really hard to say. The two obvious ways would be if they put some movies in theaters, but that wouldn't necessarily be a change for Netflix movies. It would just be continuing what happens with Warner Brothers movies, so you might not feel it that much. Odds are that the price of Netflix would eventually go up because they're going to add a bunch of new programming. And then how you access HBO could change, right? Are you buying it and watching it within Netflix? Does HBO become cheaper as a result of that? But Netflix hasn't said a lot, so it's hard to say at this point.
Great. Thank you. So moving on to the next part, America's media war and Trump. Obviously, Netflix will be facing regulatory issues to get this deal done. And how are you seeing where things are going?
Well, President Trump has been complimentary towards Netflix co-CEO Ted Sarandos, as well as the company. But he's also said that they would have to study the market share because that company would have a lot of power. The administration hasn't really come down. You've seen some politicians come out, both Democrats and Republicans, and raise concerns about the deal. But we haven't gotten a clear indication of whether Trump would direct the different agencies to challenge it or sue to block a deal yet.
I think it depends on how they define the market.
Well, yeah, that's one of the big factors. I mean, look, when it comes to Trump, a lot of the reasons why things happen are more personal. You know, he likes you, he doesn't. But if you were talking about a more traditional, antitrust review, yes, the big question would be, how are you defining the market for entertainment? The Paramount, in trying to stop a Netflix deal, wants to define it as narrowly as possible. So that means just look at Hollywood streaming services. And by that definition, Netflix is clearly the biggest player, and this would make it even stronger. Netflix would push for you to look at the market for entertainment far more broadly, whether that's including all of television. So you're including kind of linear networks with streaming, or also even including social media, whether it's YouTube or Instagram or TikTok. And we don't know how they're going to define it.
And after Netflix announced the deal, the Paramount Skydance launched a hostile takeover bid for all of Warner Brothers, despite the fact that Netflix is trying to buy the only the film and streaming part of the Warner Brothers. Paramount Skydance's newly formed company resulting from the merger of Paramount and Skydance, led by David Ellison, as you talked about. And he's the son of Larry Ellison, the founder and co-chair of Oracle. Larry has been known for the close relationship with Donald Trump. So what are they going to do in this bidding race? What did you find out about it so far?
Well, right now, they're trying to make the case that their offer was better, right? The Paramount has made 6 offers for Warner Brothers Discovery. They really kicked this process off when they made an unsolicited bid a few months ago. They feel that Warner Brothers Discovery did not seriously examine their most recent bid because they had already decided to go with Netflix. Though we don't know if that's true, Warner Brothers Discovery did announce that it was picking Netflix, I think, a day or two after Paramount sent its new bid. So their initial effort was to get the board to agree to their offer that had previously been rejected. Nobody thinks that is likely to happen. But as they sort of forced Warner Brothers to at least pay attention to them by threatening to go directly to shareholders. So they've proposed what's called a tender offer, which would mean that in January, shareholders of Warner Brothers Discovery could vote, and if more of them pick the Paramount offer, then that is the one that happens. We don't know exactly how this is going to play out. The Warner Brothers Discovery board is expected to reject the Paramount offer because they already rejected it. And then there's a few possibilities. They could reject it, but say, hey, we're open to talking more, make us a better offer, and Paramount could make a higher offer. Paramount, they could say, we're rejecting it and we don't want to keep talking, in which case Paramount might go directly to shareholders and try to proceed with the tender offer. There's even a possibility, I've heard some people say that, Warner Brothers would work with Netflix to improve it a little bit, just enough to drive Paramount away. But it's kind of an open question as to how exactly it's going to play out. Well, Paramount has a lot of outside financing, as would be expected with a deal of this size, but theirs is unusual in that, and they have money from 3 sovereign wealth funds from the Middle East, the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Emiratis. That has been a point of controversy. The sources at Warner Brothers Discovery say that the board was uncomfortable with the idea of selling to a consortium with so much foreign money, in particular from kind of dictatorships in the Middle East. But they're a key part of the Paramount offer. And I guess we'll see if they decide to change that to win. but they are relying on those financiers for a lot of money. So if they did, it would require the Ellison family to put up even more of its fortune.
Why does Paramount want Warner Brothers so bad?
Well, Paramount is by comparison, and certainly to Netflix, a small fry, a minnow, right? They are kind of one of the weaker studios in town, one of the weaker streaming services. They make most of their money from these cable networks that are shrinking and losing relevance. They have cable networks like Nickelodeon and MTV that were hugely influential 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but haven't mattered for a while. And they feel that Warner Brothers would accomplish a few things for them. They'd get the libraries from HBO and Warner Brothers, which would make their streaming service much stronger. They could combine the HBO Max streaming service with their Paramount Plus streaming service and have potentially a streamer that could compete with Netflix and Disney and Amazon, sort of the top tier of streaming services. It would also, through this deal, allow them to fire a ton of people and take a lot of cost out, and hopefully in their mind create an even more profitable and successful company.
What is President Trump trying to do here? Because the Paramount's offer includes the cable network side of the Warner Brothers, which includes CNN, and the Paramount's guidance already holds the CBS News department, and Trump administration is seemingly trying to influence some sort of the news media in the United States right now. So what is he trying to do?
Well, he wants to take any approach that would allow the news coverage of him to be more favorable, right? He is forever in his mind the victim. He feels like the media is out to get him, even though he has risen to power in large part by constant media attention. And so CNN has been a frequent target of his. He likes to complain about their coverage. And even though CNN has been owned for a while by people that most would consider conservative, right? When it was owned by AT&T, that's a company that's kind of led by a more Republican-leaning executive team. It's now in its current form of Warner Brothers Discovery. One of the big shareholders is John Malone, who is an outspoken conservative. But he just likes to attack CNN. And so anything that can make CNN look bad or can potentially influence the coverage is what he's after. I don't think there's some grand plan or scheme here.
Is he serious about getting CNN under his control?
No. I mean, I don't know how that would happen, really.
And I have one more question before going into the final part. Is there a possibility in this bidding process, if Disney will come in, or Apple will come in, or Amazon will come in?
It's possible, right? The deal doesn't the window of opportunity doesn't close until the shareholders of the company approve the deal. Then it's almost impossible to bring in a new bidder. But none of those companies have demonstrated much interest, to my knowledge. So I wouldn't bet on it.
And moving into the final part, the future of media, Netflix versus YouTube. So yeah, I want to step back a little bit here and see a bigger picture of the industry. People say Netflix is not competing with other paid streaming media platforms and movie studios. It's YouTube. What do you think about the competition between these two? Or is it just the narrative of Netflix that try to convince the regulators that the combined businesses is not a monopoly?
No, I don't think it's just a narrative of Netflix, because one of the big stories of this year and really the last couple of years has been the surge in YouTube on television, right? The data measurement company Nielsen puts out new charts every month that shows, how much time people are spending with different streaming services on their TVs. And people have always thought of YouTube as something you watch on your phone or maybe your laptop or your tablet, but YouTube is now far and away the most popular streaming service on television. And so that has driven home that, especially for kind of viewers let's say under 30, that YouTube has replaced a lot of television. So I think it's a very real competitor, and you've seen Netflix and other media companies trying to figure out, are there types of programming or talent that are popular on YouTube that we should be bringing into our fold.
So Netflix has been spending billions of dollars every year to produce the content. Or on the other hand, YouTube is basically a platform of user-generated content. So they just pay the advertising dollars back to the creators. What do you think which side will win eventually?
Well, YouTube is winning in terms of time spent. That's kind of obvious, right? There's just so much more to watch on YouTube, just an endless amount of video, and it's global and it's free, so it makes it much easier. There are markets, in India where YouTube is huge and Netflix is doing okay, but because people have to pay for it, Netflix is a tiny fraction of the size, right? It varies by the market. In the US, YouTube is bigger than Netflix, but they're kind of close. In much poorer countries, YouTube is so much bigger than Netflix. The thing that Netflix has going for it is, even if it's not as big in terms of usage, it's comparable in terms of revenue, and it's, depending on your estimates, more profitable, right? Because it is not, a lot of those areas where YouTube is quite big, it's very hard to make money. There's not a robust advertising market. Another thing, and you brought up the kind of the business models, Netflix has a variable cost model, which means it can kind of control its cost. YouTube is pretty fixed, right? YouTube gives 55% revenue share to its creators. So while it's not paying for the programming, it does have to share a significant portion of the revenue for each of those videos. Netflix can kind of control how much it's spending a little bit, which is one of the reasons why you've seen Netflix's profits go up a lot over the last couple of years.
Analysts say that YouTube is going to be the biggest media this year. Are you agreeing with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the most popular media service in the world, and it's not really close. It's YouTube, it's Instagram. Netflix is a step down just in terms of usage and influence.
And how would the Warner Brothers deal help Netflix get ahead of YouTube?
Well, I don't know that it would help Netflix get ahead of YouTube in terms of consumption, but it would help Netflix lean into what its advantage is on YouTube, right? YouTube has everything, but it doesn't have a lot of sort of that high-end Hollywood programming. The closest it comes is trailers or clips from shows, but you're not going to see, full award-winning movies and television shows. And so in adding Warner Brothers and HBO, Netflix would have an even greater share of that market, and it would reinforce that it's premium, and it would let Netflix raise prices even more, so it could generate more revenue, generate more profit.
Mm-hmm. But YouTube has also been focusing on the living room features for people watching YouTube on TV, and they focus more quality videos and more like stories and the series things. How are those features going to play out for YouTube, the competition against Netflix and others?
Right. Well, look, like I said, YouTube has made huge strides in terms of people watching it on television. Its efforts to get sort of more premium shows haven't worked as well, right? There's some scripted programming on YouTube, but most of it is still not very good and aimed at young people. And they're trying to change how they present some of the different channels, so they come off as sort of shows instead of just channels or random videos. But I think all of that is still very much a work in progress.
So do you think more like not like which will win, or more like a both will win?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a zero-sum game. Yes, it's true that the more time people spend with YouTube, they don't spend it with Netflix and vice versa. But they've been the two biggest online video platforms in the world for many years now. I think they will continue to be for the foreseeable future. So while they are very much in competition with each other and trying to find ways to kind of steal from the other one, I don't think that the success of one means the failure of the other.
Okay, I have one last question. Looking ahead for next year, 2026, what do you expect is happening in Hollywood or streaming, the intersection of streaming and tech? business in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest stories will probably be, we'll find out who wins Warner Brothers, and that will be a huge, huge, huge story. No matter what, if Netflix gets it, that changes Netflix. If Paramount gets it, suddenly you have this big new player. I think you're going to have a lot more deal making and discussions about kind of AI, generative AI and video. Disney just did a big deal with OpenAI. I think you'll see more companies do deals like that. We'll find out, I guess, if apps like Sora and VO become popular or not. There are some negotiations that are going to come up between Hollywood labor unions and the studios, and so there's the potential for another strike. That would obviously be very bad for the industry. Those are the probably, just off the top of my head, I think the biggest stories that we'll see next year.
Mm-hmm. Great to hear. Okay, I appreciate it taking the time today, and thank you, Lucas Shaw. Thank you for being the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.